Good evening, everyone. My name's Miriam Suss, and I'm a member of the Melbourne University Social Work Alumni Association. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar this evening. And our topic, as you know, is Housing the Homeless, Prevention and Response. Great timing, because we're actually a day after World Social Work Day, and we're really celebrating social work, but also learning about some really important issues, particularly at a time when we're experiencing the pandemic. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted our community in countless ways. We've particularly seen the effect on the homeless and people who sleep rough, or people who are at risk of losing their accommodation, and they've been particularly hard hit by this crisis. Homeless people services across the country have rapidly responded to these ever-changing needs and have also come up with some creative solutions and been able to put in place some very interesting services. Many of you will know that we have had an earlier webinar earlier in 2020. And moving on from there, we'd like to understand how some of the responses have resulted in outcomes for the people that are affected. And we've got three very experienced speakers that we're all looking forward to hearing today. Just as always, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please use the chat function if you'd like to ask any questions. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentations of our three speakers, and we hope that you'll respond to their presentations and engage in some kind of conversation with us. So I will start with Bevan Warner. Sorry, Bevan, again. Bevan is since 2018, he's been the CEO of Launch Housing, one of Victoria's largest providers of housing and homeless support services. He's a strategist, a communicator, influencer, and a strong advocate for social justice. His careers included dispute resolution, enterprise changing management, business process improvement, and cross-cultural awareness. We are delighted that he's joining us today, and welcome, Bevan.
Thanks, Miriam. And thank you everyone for your interest in tonight's proceeding. I just want to acknowledge that I'm sitting here in Collingwood on Wurundjeri land, land of the Kulin Nation, land that was never ceded, and pay my respects to First Nations people past and present. And look, happy International Social Workers Day. I think we need to celebrate. We need more people and institutions acting on social outcomes. We're clearly more than an economy, and I wish our elected leaders were speaking to that truth more often. Essentially, I'm going to talk about what we did through the COVID pandemic, a little bit about some market research that we undertook into community attitudes, and explain why we're launching next week a major public participation and awareness raising campaign to engage people in a practical way, to give them an outlet for being concerned about solutions for homelessness, and why we think we should be framing a Melbourne Zero objective, where Melbourne seeks to be a world-leading city in ending homelessness as we sort of build back better out of the COVID social and economic response. But first, launch housing. Yes, we've got a 70-year tradition, proudly secular. Our service philosophy bears some explanation. That secular tradition has resulted in a strong commitment to delivering services within a human rights framework. That means that we prioritise meeting people where they are and working alongside them to assist them to achieve what they think a safe and dignified life is like. That means we've been at the forefront of harm minimisation, for instance, in the 70s, incorporating alcohol use in our crisis accommodation, preferring people to drink at home who had an addiction rather than cross the Spencer Street train lines and risk getting run over on what was New Gordon House and is now the site of the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. So basically in the pandemic, we had, it's all seared in our memory, we all lived through it, but the very swift and principled response led by the government, operationalised by the community service sector, recognised that in a pandemic, there was a public health threat to other people posed by people experiencing homelessness because they couldn't self-isolate, and therefore that was a public health imperative to do something about that problem. Of course, there was the moral imperative that people experiencing homelessness not able to self-isolate, more likely to both contract, pass on, and to suffer very severe consequences due to other underlying health issues occasioned by their homelessness, and therefore there was a moral imperative to help people into safety. Many people would know that produced an emergency response of having people in hotels, and there are many people still in hotels now, 7, 8, 9 months later. But the size of the response bears remarking upon. At one point we had 4,000 people across the state in hotels. I think 6,000 people in total had a period of emergency accommodation in a hotel. At one point, Launch Housing had 1,800 people that we were responsible for, both paying the bills, providing emotional support, and also coordinating with partner agencies in the sector, amazing logistical exercises around food and hygiene and coordinating staff health and safety responses in what was a very difficult environment, and resolving neighbourhood concerns, and on a scale of pressure, if you like, that was put in place immediately with no systems behind it. And we went from something like 40 people a night to 1,800 people a night in about 4 weeks. So that was an incredibly pressured time, and staff were amazing in achieving that initial safety. What we've then had is a very wonderful response from the state government, both in policy terms and in funding terms. We've got two big things happening, a $5.3 billion investment called the Big Build in additional social housing to make up for a terrible shortfall in social housing in Victoria that had been allowed to exist for many years. That's good economic stimulus, as well as delivering a much needed and overdue social outcome. We've also had a very promising response around what's called the Homelessness to Home program, which is in effect a multidisciplinary support program involving agencies working in the alcohol and other drug, community clinical mental health, primary health care, homelessness support agencies like Launch Housing in coordinating the exits for people still in emergency accommodation in hotels into secure head leased private properties in the private rental market as a step before they get into long-term secure public or community housing. So housing plus support for people with the most complex needs who have experienced the most trauma in their life, which is associated with their current experience of homelessness. Unpacking all of that, the system threw up people who were experiencing periodic rough sleeping at 5 times the number than official estimates. And we've got a great opportunity now to do something with that problem, and which brings me to some of our market research. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. Sorry, I'm having some problem here. Now I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so sorry for the delay. So we commissioned this market research to at the peak of the pandemic and released it in November. And what it told us was that people had a narrow view on what homelessness looks like, very traditional views. And the second point is a real good one for us. We saw an outpouring of empathy with 76% of people agreeing that homelessness could happen to anyone. And that's in contrast to this belief we have that inaction in solving homelessness in the past is tied to this stubborn persistence that somehow people choose homelessness, that it's a result of their own personal failures. And that's tied into this sort of deep-seated view within the community that we are an egalitarian society, that we are somehow a meritocracy and everyone finds their natural level, the education's the pathway to opportunity, and that if people just tried hard enough, or if you try, you'll succeed. And what that narrative in our community conversation doesn't recognise is the experience of trauma or bad luck. And it's sort of inconsistent with what we know about educational outcomes, where educational outcomes or poor educational outcomes map to postcode. So we have postcode injustice very prevalent in Australia, and there's this idea, though, that somehow people should just be able to overcome. So we're really pleased to see this idea that people believe that homelessness could happen to anyone, and equally that there's a call to government to do something about it. The pandemic told us that it has shown us that our own health is intimately connected to the health of the person next to us, and that everyone needs shelter. We've had this personal experience with the confines of home, being frustrated by being confined. We've recognised the importance of home, and we're now starting to think about, well, what is happening to the world that we're living in, and what's it going to be like in the future? So there's a rare opportunity for a conversation in the community about what good looks like. And that brings me back to sort of my final sort of observation. We want to make sure that the reflection point that's occurring in the community as we talk about building back better includes a conversation about what the legacy of COVID will be like for Melbourne. And we've got a belief that one of the great natural assets that Melbourne has is its history and its progressive pride in being an international city, sometimes labelled the world's most livable city, but not for everybody. And to contrast that pride as a progressive capital, an outward-facing international city that did it tougher than other places around Australia, and to say, why can't our catch cry be that Melbourne should be a world-leading city in ending homelessness? And a world-leading city in ending homelessness needs a few ingredients. It needs a measure. So we're committed to developing and publishing an annual Capital Cities Index that will rank Melbourne's progress in ending homelessness against leading cities around the world. It involves it needs an opportunity for the community to get behind that idea, which is why we're launching our Roughing It Challenge next week, which is effectively an opportunity for people to experience not sleeping in their own bed, living on $10 a day, and living with one bag for either 1, 3 or 5 days, not to trivialise the experience of homelessness, but to respond to what the market research has told us, that people want something they can practically do to lean in and be part of a solution. And we believe that that community awareness raising and fundraising, but community awareness raising activity will build out our supporter base beyond people who work in the system who already think like us. And over time, we'll connect it to a Year 9 society and environment curriculum support program for teachers, so that we can generate conversations around the kitchen table between parents and their children about, why isn't Melbourne a world leading city in homelessness, ending homelessness? Why do we have this problem? Why can't we solve our housing policies and demand political action so that we don't retreat to where we were? So we want that community event called the Roughing It Challenge in 5 years to be Australia's biggest community awareness raising and participation event on a social issue in the country. And that's connected deeply to this idea that we need to frame a conversation for Victorians about Melbourne being a world leading city in ending homelessness, and backing that up with practical action on how that would occur. I can talk and respond to questions about what that might look like, but we know where the solutions are and we know what's involved to develop them. What we haven't had is sufficient support and coordination for that to occur. And we're determined to use the experience of COVID to create that opportunity to aim very high and not to retreat to moving people through or warehousing them in an unfair homelessness service system, which was what was happening before COVID. I'll pause there, Miriam.
Okay, thank you, Bevan. And just a question for you. We're all really reflecting on how things are going to go when we get back to normal, when some of these restrictions lift, and when perhaps some of these policies need to be reviewed and people have a bit more freedom of movement. How do you think that will affect some of the residents now in some of these accommodation places?
I think we'll move about in the community in the same way that other members of the community move about. What we've got is a wonderful opportunity to solve homelessness for about 1,800 people, is the size of the government package, who had experienced chronic rough sleeping over many years. So in terms of launch housing clients, that's an average history of sort of coming in and out of the homelessness service system of 8 years. So we're going to take 1,800 people into secure housing, but unless we stop the inflow of people into homelessness with other government policies and solutions, then we'll get back to where we were. The social housing that's going to be built is amazing, but unless it's built into a 10 or 15 year forward plan of ongoing capital works, it won't make a dent on the public housing waiting list. So we've got the right policies and a massive amount of initial government investment that needs to sort of be built into the future. So it's just part of what government does. But most importantly, I think we have to engage the community in a belief that homelessness is not inevitable, that it's not a natural part of a first world economy, and it's not a natural part of the human condition. And in fact, while it might look like an intractable problem, solutions exist. And if we don't change hearts and minds about that, then there won't be any demand on government to stay the distance.
Thank you. Thanks, Bevan. Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm going to move on to Jess now. Just introducing Jess. She's a senior, it's Dr. Jess Ferd, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne, conducting research on youth homelessness. Her primary research focus is on youth homelessness, and she investigates modifiable predictors of youth homelessness and associated problems. Her research interests centre on promoting the health and wellbeing of adolescents and young people. Jess, I'm going to ask you a few questions about the work that you've been doing. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're aware that there need to be robust strategies for early intervention and prevention of homelessness in vulnerable populations, your particular area being with young people. What are some of these strategies, Jess?
Yeah, so I might start just by kind of giving a little bit of an overview of the work that I've been doing. And it really focuses on two specific areas. One, how we stop that inflow to homelessness that Bevan was just talking about. And then secondly, for those young people who do experience homelessness, how do we work with them to address health and social issues that they might have and support healthy development for them across their life course after their experience of homelessness. So in terms of strategies, I think, we can look at strategies from both of those areas. In terms of the inflow into homelessness, I think one of the most important strategies around prevention is getting to young people before they become at risk of homelessness. And the work that we've been doing with myself here in Victoria and some colleagues in Washington State is looking at, what is it that's happening in adolescents' lives from around the age 12 or 13 mark to then predict their homelessness, for want of a better term, at age 25. And the things that are coming out of that are things like, less positive management strategies within the family, higher conflict families, not at the level that we would probably classify as abusive family environments, but high conflict family environments. And then, in the school environment, these are young people who are already, underachieving academically, or, a lot of them have experienced suspension from school. And so I think, in terms of prevention and how do we stop the inflow, we need to get to these young people before the period where they're already rough sleeping or they're already trying to access services. So it could be things like looking at, do we look at modifying policies in the education sector around school suspension? Do we intervene earlier with families who are struggling to stop the escalation of the less positive, family management practices? You're still on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
That's the word of the day, you're on mute. Jess, I think some of your strategies will involve multidisciplinary teams working together to address the issues for adolescents and young adults. What kinds of people are in your teams, and what are some of the skills that are needed by those people?
Yeah, look, what I might do with that is really draw on what some of the young people that I have been working with have talked about. So as part of this program of research, my team has gone out and interviewed about 60 young people in Victoria, and talk to them about what they've been through, what homelessness is like for them. But we had a specific section at the end of that asked them what would they like health professionals to know. And I think the biggest thing that has come out of that is the shame and the stigma that these young people are feeling about their history, about their current situation, about the few prospects that they see for their future. And so I think when we talk about multidisciplinary teams, I think it's important to kind of, highlight that it's no one team that needs to take the lead, so to speak. I think it's multiple teams coming together. And in those multiple teams, you know, I think about mental health teams. As Bevan said, a lot of these young people have childhood trauma that they need to deal with. I'm talking about substance use teams for the young people who are experimenting or maybe already embedded in using drugs and alcohol, but also teams that are connected up with employment and education, because these are young people who, despite their circumstances, have talked really openly about wanting a future for themselves, but needing the help to do that. And I think when we think about these multidisciplinary teams, it's more than just the immediate need. It's how do we support these young people through their homelessness experience and beyond that, so that they can develop into healthy, functioning members of society that they want to be.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on. Thank you for your presentation, Jess. And I'd like to introduce Elisa Buggy, who has recently been appointed the CEO of Flat Out, which is a housing case management agency for women coming out of prison. So we're moving into another area of society, and Elisa is a social worker originally from Tasmania, who started her career in the not-for-profit sector in the NIDS area, and she then helped to develop Tasmania's drug court before moving to Victoria to manage the drug court. So she has that experience in her background, and the family drug treatment court here. So now she's moved into the area of women coming out of prison. Elisa, perhaps if we can ask you to speak a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing, and then perhaps I'll ask you some questions.
Sure, Miriam, thanks so much for having me. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak at on such a prestigious occasion. Happy International Social Workers Day, everybody, all of my fellow social workers. I want to also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which I'm coming from. That's the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong lands of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's particularly important from our context of Flat Out to pay respect also and acknowledge the increasing and shamefully so numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are being incarcerated in increasing numbers across the country at the moment. In fact, between 2008 and 2018, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have increased in Victoria alone by 406%. Which is just astonishing and completely unacceptable. I am going to speak a little bit first about Flat Out. I prepared a presentation and I'm happy to share it, although when we were doing the tests, I'm a little worried now, Lou, that I might share my notes instead. So instead, I'm pretty familiar and au fait with it. So if you're all happy with listening to me speak to it rather than give you all the pictorials, I'm very happy to do that. So Flat Out has been around for 33 years now. I notice some of you in the attendees list will be very familiar with the story of Flat Out, much more so than me even. I've been with Flat Out for almost 2 years now, and as Miriam says, I did spend some time in the courts in both Tasmania and more recently Victoria, and have also worked in the alcohol and other drug space as well in the not-for-profit land, both in Tasmania and Victoria. And I came to Flat Out for a few reasons. One of them is because, and the main one is because the I think the values base of an organisation that refuses to accept that that our response to social injustice and things like trauma, mental ill health, substance use, and indeed homelessness is one of justice. And in fact, one of the things that's most striking for me as I continue my work in this space and to learn from all of the amazing team who are much more eloquent on this topic than I am, I have to say, Miriam, and they were all schooling me today when I mentioned that I was speaking to you all tonight and how nervous I would be about doing that. Each of them sat me down at some point, either virtually or in person, to let me know exactly what I should be saying tonight to all of you, because they're extraordinary advocates for the people that they support and who they work with and walk alongside every single day. And one of the things that they've taught me and the women and the people that we support have taught me along the way now and in my former time in the justice system is that too often our community, our government responses, our state responses, federally, state, and our social responses are driven by justice rather than health and social support, and the recognition of the extraordinary trauma that can come. And when I'm speaking, I'm talking particularly about criminalized populations, the extraordinary trauma that people already experience, in addition to the trauma that comes about from being criminalized and indeed imprisoned. So I wanted to take you through just a few, give you paint the picture by numbers. For those of you who know me a little bit or even well, you'll know that very often I make the comment that any time that I use statistics or numbers to paint a picture, it always feels very, very reductionist to me. And as a social worker, I always find that a little bit challenging, but I came into social work as a systems changer and to look at the macro rather than the micro, although I'm not sure that they're necessarily that inextricable. Nevertheless, I do always feel a little bit uncomfortable shouting statistics and numbers at people. Nevertheless, please bear with me while I do that so that you can get a sense of where we're at in Victoria in terms of criminalised women, specifically women who are in the prison system. So as of Friday afternoon, so last Friday just gone, the 12th of March, there were 430 women in prison in Victoria. Almost 50% of them were unsentenced. So many of you will be familiar with the amendments to the bail legislation recently, 2017, 2018. Somebody's going to correct me about that. David, I'm sorry. I should know that off by heart. But when the bail reforms came into place, what that meant in particular for women in this state was that we saw a huge influx of women who were imprisoned by remand, which means they were unsentenced. And I'm dismayed to tell you also that many of those ultimately received a non-custodial sentence. That is that they were never going to go to prison in the first place on the sentences that they eventually received. So to give you again numbers, that looks like 210 women unsentenced in prison as of Friday, and 220 who were serving a custodial sentence. The women's prison population, not only for Aboriginal women, increased by 406.7% between 2008 and 2018 in this state, but the women's prison population overall increased by 137.8%. At Flat Out, we work with approximately 160 women per year, and 100% of those women have experienced homelessness or are currently homeless at the time of, or in transient or precarious living arrangements at the time of their referral. Also, alarmingly, 100% of those women have also experienced family violence. 63% of criminalised women overall in this state, again in 2018, experienced poor mental health, compared with 13.5% for non-criminalised women, and 83% of criminalised women experienced AOD misuse, compared with 9% of the non-criminalised women population in Victoria. I wanted to touch back on in relation to the topic of homelessness and criminalised women, particularly women in prison. I wanted to come back to the topic of criminalised women and homelessness, and globally, not just at Flat Out. That is a little less sobering, but nevertheless still sobering. 44% of criminalised women have experienced homelessness, compared with 2.5% of non-criminalised women in 2018 in Victoria. Family violence is one of the biggest drivers of homelessness for women, and homelessness, especially when co-occurring with substance misuse and or mental ill health, renders women much more likely to come into contact with police, which ultimately, of course, increases the chances of criminalisation. Now, for women who have already been criminalised, coming into contact with the police makes them much, much more likely to be further criminalised and indeed face prison and either through remand or eventual sentence. For women who have housing before they go to prison, unfortunately, they're really likely to lose their property and become homeless while they're in prison. And this is particularly true of the people that we support in Flat Out. Time and time again, whether or not it's because of loss of income and a woman owns a house, or they've been in a public housing or a transitional housing property, and certainly if they've been in emergency accommodation prior to being imprisoned, they are very much likely to come out homeless. For women who are homeless in prison, the safe and affordable housing is really difficult to establish prior to release. That's for a range of reasons, and certainly the government's announcement of working in partnership with Women's Housing recently, particularly in relation to the people on remand, was welcome, and will, just as Bevan was speaking about earlier, is certainly a foot in the right direction, but it will be there'll be lots more of that needed if we're ever to realise true safe and affordable housing for those 430 women that are currently inside. This means that most women end up in emergency accommodation upon release, including rooming houses, some of which you'll already be aware of because they're fairly notorious, and they come up in the papers time and time again, and yet they still exist, and yet they are still operating, and yet they are still taking money to provide barely a roof over people's heads and putting people in much, much more precarious situations. It's neither safe nor affordable in the long term, and for some women, they're forced back into situations of family violence. And what we know about that, and there's one of the PhD students at the University of Melbourne has looked at this particularly risky scenario of women who are released back into situations of family violence, who are at increased likelihood of death at the hands of their perpetrator. All of these precarious and riskful situations render it much more difficult for criminalised women to exit the rotating door of the prison system. And what that means then, of course, is that they continue to be criminalised, recriminalised, further criminalised, and go in and out of a cycle of trauma, compound fractures at that. And as I said before, most of the time, That's because we respond to many of the difficulties and the trauma-driven presentations that criminalised women might present with a justice response and a punitive response, usually involving police as a first responder, and usually meaning that puts that woman at further risk of criminalisation, rather than giving them the hand and the support that they need to get out of that revolving door.
Elisa, thank you for that. I'd like to ask you a question that I'm actually going to put to the other speakers as well after you, because it's about policy, social policy, and it's about the future, and it's about what you would like to see happen so that the groups that you work with could be better supported in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Miriam, for the question. I had prepared for this, and as I said, my team were very, very clear in their responses. I think for me, the first and most significant thing that we might be able to do is to change our thinking in terms of our first responses to people who are homeless, to be able to give them the support that they need, rather than to respond to what is perceived as less than palatable behaviour in the community, normally because people are frightened, scared, and in absolute survival mode. I think the other thing that I would recommend as well, stepping up a bit, is for us to, as a whole system and as a homelessness sector, to really understand and properly understand the trauma-informed practice, rather than using the buzzword, to properly and truly understand and engage with that, and to look at our own, be it conscious or otherwise, bias and stigma and judgment that comes when working with people with a criminal record. And finally, and just in a really basic way, I agree with Bevan that the announcements recently in terms of injections of funds into the homelessness sector and into the housing sector are welcome, certainly. But also, as he said, that there's 12,000 properties roughly that will come out of the big build. The wait list for public housing is in excess of 40,000. And one of the other things that I would say as well, without wanting to take anybody else's time, so finally, the other thing that I would say is that I am genuinely concerned about the concept of that we're moving away from social housing into a community housing model, and moving away from public housing, more importantly, which means that it's much more driven by business, much more driven by the bottom line, and therefore renders housing less affordable in the long term and less sustainable, certainly for women who have been criminalised in the past, because their rates of unemployment and education are unemployment is much higher, education much lower. I could go on, Miriam, but I won't. I'll give up.
Okay, I'd like to give Jess and Bevan the opportunity to perhaps address that very same question. I know you've both touched on it, but perhaps we start with Jess. What are your hopes and aspirations for future policy development in this area?
Look, I think that COVID has given us a real opportunity to kind of step back and say, what are the issues that we need to tackle, and which policy sector is best suited to doing that? For instance, if we look at relationships between homelessness and mental health, homelessness and family violence, homelessness and trauma, is that better suited under mental health policies? And some of that has started to come out of the Royal Commission last week. And then I think the other more social policy change I would like to see is around young people who present to homelessness services and are unaccompanied. That's a group of young people that has very low rates of being transferred into stable housing options. And so I think that's something that we really have an opportunity to look at moving forward.
Jess, thank you. Before I go to Bevan, I'm actually going to ask whether any of our participants, we've got 58 people who are participating in the webinar, love to get a couple of questions from you. So please don't be shy. And in the meantime, we're just asking Bevan whether you've got some comments, Bevan, about what you'd like to see in terms of future directions that would assist the groups that you've been working with. Can we, there you go.
Okay.
Just not on camera yet.
You can hear me though?
Yes, we can hear you.
So it's the host is stopping the video at the moment, but anyway, my hope would be that we could have a national housing policy. We don't have one in Australia, and we don't have one in Australia. And at the moment, the Commonwealth government, in the recent budget refused all the expert economic advice about investing in social housing, drew a hard line in the sand and said social housing or public housing is not their responsibility, it's the responsibility of the states. Meanwhile, Commonwealth housing policy is at best inflating asset prices and encouraging people into first home ownership with subsidies and people with an existing property into a second property through negative gearing. So we've got a very distorted housing market that's only rewarding this idea of aspirational ownership. And we've got a federal housing minister, now also a homelessness minister, who doesn't seem to care about people who don't have one, because he's saying it's not his responsibility, the responsibility of the states. So we need to tackle supply. So Commonwealth, national governments tax, they tax and they offer subsidies all over the place. We need subsidies and tax breaks for private capital to participate in building more low-cost affordable housing for people to rent, because governments will never get ahead of the curve by themselves. And secondly, from the prevention point of view, given that we've got rising income inequality, we need a much better Commonwealth rent assistance scheme so that people who are being, whether it's family violence, trauma, lack of workforce participation, a crazy housing market, can't afford to rent, that the government tops up so that they don't get evicted into homelessness purely for financial reasons, because there's an overheated property market. That's got nothing there, and I'm sort of steering clear of all the trauma-based responses, but we need the Commonwealth to step up. I mean, their job is the safety and security of all its citizens, and that's not just the defence power. If you don't have a home or somewhere safe to sleep tonight, you are not safe. And the Commonwealth government can't walk away from that and say it's the state's problem only.
Perhaps I can ask all of you, just in terms of timeliness, we've all recently heard of the outcomes of the Mental Health Royal Commission. Did that have any resonance for any of you in terms of the work you're doing? Because all of you have mentioned mental health issues as a cause of homelessness. So I'd just like to open that up.
I'm happy to quick go. We said that housing is good mental health care in our submission, and we're pleased that there's a recognition in the body of the report around the importance of housing for good mental health. I suspect that the government thinks that the response around the big build and the investment in social housing is the answer to the Royal Commission's recommendations, but I think there's a gap in there. Some people will need some form of ongoing support to maintain a good tenancy, and we think there are requirements for more permanent models of permanent supportive housing that exist elsewhere in the world, that Melbourne needs a lot more of that style of accommodation offer.
Thank you. Elisa and Jess, if you're welcome to answer that question. I've actually got a couple from the floor now, so I'm happy to go to those. Perhaps we'll move to those because we haven't got a lot of time left. Elisa, we have a question from Bella Gadsden. Can you read that question or should I read it to you? It's about your concern regarding the shift towards community housing and the privatisation of social housing. She believes the state has the ultimate responsibility. And what does effective advocacy around this look like? How do you achieve that?
It's a really good question, Bella. Socialist revolution, I'm not sure. Certainly that's maybe it's yes and. I think there is. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need a socialist revolution though, because the argument is a fiscal one as well. We spend, in the last budget, $1.8 billion was put aside for increasing the prison build in Victoria. So that was the 1920 budget, and that got rolled over again, or was it the 1819? And then it got rolled over again. Anyway, it wasn't mentioned necessarily very clearly in the budget papers with the late budget last year, but it's certainly very present. And the response when asked about why that, surely we've moved on, and if COVID has taught us anything, there is in fact really viable options and alternatives to locking everybody up, which in my view is pretty lazy policy. In fact, probably the laziest policy. And the response was very simply because we said that we were going to. So for me, it's not necessarily a socialist argument, although certainly there's elements, and I'm very happy for socialism to own it. I also think though that from a fiscal position, it is nonsensical to not put money into long-term sustainable housing for people who are ultimately costing the government, if we have to strip it right back, the most in terms of social supports, in terms of and more importantly in terms of legal injustice and punitive responses. It's a nonsense, and it's something that I think we are washing over with responses like the big build, which are held up as panaceas for all ills. They're not, and they're not going to even put a dent on the issues that arise for women who've been criminalised, and for all criminalised populations for that matter. So I don't mind how it happens, but certainly I think that there are arguments to be made at every level, at every political ideology or background that you or philosophy that you come from. Ultimately, it's just sensible.
Elisa, thank you. I'm going to address a question here about older people or people with disabilities, and I'm inclined to ask Bevan to comment on those, because our two other speakers have sort of specialist areas that they've been working on. Bevan, can you give a little bit of a comment about what homeless issues are like for the elderly?
Well, very challenging, because when we're old, we'd like to think we can age in place and we've got some form of housing stability and supports around us. So housing insecurity when you're old and have health issues is very, very challenging. The market responses or the government responses are doing positive things in relation to disability housing, where there is more disability housing coming on stream, basically because the financial incentives are there to build and operate it. We have large cohorts. Older women are the fastest growing cohort into homelessness, and that's basically a straight, they don't share the economic pie fairly, and in the event of sort of family breakdown or small business failure, late in age, often don't have the savings behind them to cope. So we've got real challenges with the elderly and people with health issues or disability in dignified responses to secure housing.
Thank you, Bevan. The last question I have here is huge and opens up a conversation that's much too long for us to manage here. And I'd like to say hello to Anne Fink, who's one of the most experienced social workers, probably, who's attending today. She's been asking she's asked whether, given that many of these issues were raised by a publication in 1970, so that's 51 years ago, and nothing seems to have changed much, do our panelists think that all their recommendations will have any impact? As I say, not a question for a quick answer. And we acknowledge that many of the issues that we as social workers deal with have been around for a very long time. And I think we're optimistic and we work hard to address the issues that we face as social workers, and hope that these policies will come to fruition. Any quick answers there from any of our panelists?
Miriam, I have a reasonably quick answer, and I also I feel a bit humbled answering a question from Anne, but I would suggest that it's not necessarily the responses that are the problem. It's that they're not being adopted and they're not being put into practice, and so we're not being listened to, and we keep banging the drum, and we've got to bang it, I don't know, in a different way, louder, who knows, but I'm as dismayed as your question suggests you are, and yet am optimistic, because we saw marginal change in a horrible situation like the pandemic, and it was for the better, and if we could just keep putting feet forward in that regard, then perhaps some of the responses that we've all suggested tonight might be picked up and actually put into effect, and then we can actually see whether they work or not, and whether we were right or not.
Thank you, Elisa. Well said. Okay, so we've reached our time limit, and first of all, I'd like to thank all our speakers, because you have a wealth of experience and you've brought it in a very articulate way to our participants today. We thank you for that. We thank you for your ongoing work and commitment and dedication to the people that you work with. So thank you. And in closing, I'd like to thank the people of the Indigenous groups on whose land we have met today, and to pay my respects to the elders and any participants who may have been with us today. We look forward to some more webinars of this kind. We're actually planning to celebrate 80 years of social work education at the University of Melbourne. There'll be some additional events and some exciting ones, and we hope that all of you who've been here today will participate in those and follow us through that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.